Miles, would you like to pick us off?
Yes, thank you, Mel, and welcome everybody. It looks like we've got a good attendance here today, and it's right at 4 o'clock, so we're going to jump straight into the first in a series of zoning code update webinars. We're starting obviously today with the mobile home zone, and this will be the first in a series that will be kicking off throughout the next few weeks. So on the next slide, you'll be able to see our agenda for today. And this is going to be a lot of information. So we want to make the meeting as interactive as possible. And as Mel said, as we were all waiting to get started, we've got a couple different tools for doing that today that we'll walk you through in a moment. But to set the stage, we want to take about 10 minutes today and just frame the big picture. What is zoning? Why are we updating the code? And then we'll dive into a little bit of more detail in the changes that are being considered for this particular zone. And then we want to spend the bulk of the agenda in Q&A. And so, as we mentioned, there's a few different ways to do that we'll walk through in a minute. There's also going to be a follow-up survey available for you to get into and provide more granular feedback on some of what you see today. And if you don't recall everything you see today, that is absolutely okay. It's going to be a lot of detail, and this recording will be emailed out and posted on the town's website. So you'll have an opportunity to share that and go deeper into it with friends and neighbors. So you can always reach out to the planning team at planning@crestedbutte.co.gov. So now that we know what's on the agenda, let's quickly introduce who is going to be presenting today. So I'm Miles Graham. I've been fortunate enough to work with the town in facilitating a number of the Community Compass efforts, and we'll be hearing today from a few town staff, starting with Mel, who I will let introduce herself.
So thanks, Miles, and thank you all so much for being here this Wednesday afternoon. I'm Mel Yema, the town's Community Development Director. Over to you, Jesse.
Jesse Early. I'm the senior planner here with the town of Crested Butte, and I'm the current planning manager. Over to you, Caitlin.
And my name is Caitlin Archambault. I am a planner here at the town of Crested Butte, and I apologize that I won't be showing my face today. I have to have my laptop closed in order to use my computer screen, but I am here and excited to get started.
Excellent. Well, let's dive right into it. On the next slide, you'll see the menti.com tool that we'll be using for some different polling and interactive exercises here today to make this webinar as fun as possible. So what you can do, and it looks like many of you already have, but just one last call that you can take your phone out and scan this QR code and then follow along to the polling prompts that we're going to be using today. Or you can go to menti.com and enter in the code that you see here, and it will stay on the top of the page as we move through the presentation as well. So we'll have a few different kind of warm-ups that you'll be able to use today to get comfortable with the tool. The first one is this: in a single word, what brought you to this webinar today? And you should be prompted to answer this via Menti. And while you're doing that, I also want to call your attention to the Zoom Q&A function that we're going to be using today, primarily towards the end of the meeting. But you can enter your questions in that control bar along the bottom. Click on Q&A. You can answer some questions as you have them, and we'll answer them during the discussion portion of the agenda. So it looks like a few of you have gotten into the Menti today, and so it looks like a couple owners and learning about zoning. And we'll give it maybe 1 or 2 more seconds to see if anybody else wants to chime in. And again, this is our warm-up exercise. So just designed to give you a sense of the tools we'll be using today. And I did see that Q&A feature is pretty intuitive and easy to use well. And a couple of you all are doing that already. So we can add another entry to zoning and a parking entry to it. And what do you say, Mel? Should we keep moving on now that
Yeah,
we've done our test here? Any insights that you want to bring?
let's keep moving on. Thanks, Miles, and thank you all for that icebreaker. So let's start off with the big picture. Why are we updating the code and how are we going to go about it? So we all love, hopefully, Crested Butte and its small town charm and sense of community. But our community faces a lot of challenges and a lot of change is happening to us. And for a long time, we've, as a town, have been reacting incrementally. So a lot of growth is happening to us and all around us, surrounding the town. Crested Butte, the town itself, is landlocked and limited in development potential. And with kind of that demand of the desire to be here and live here and for this community, our market has really become out of balance, where you see the free market is really catering to amenities, tourism, luxury of the new developments being made, while those community needs like community housing, space for childcare, for those other sorts of community needs are subsidized and developed or produced or provided space for by the town or the county or our neighboring jurisdictions. So it's really out of balance. And with that, and a lot of these challenges, our community livability and affordability is eroding in many senses. So now is really the time to really be proactive, and instead of reacting incrementally to these changes, how can we identify and work together as a community towards the future that our community wants? How can we guide growth to better meet our community needs? How can we be strategic about the remaining development potential in the town? And can we try to bring some balance back into the market through regulations and incentives and a mix of both? And in general, can we make our zoning code clearer, easier to use, and just better aligned with our community values? So doing this type of proactive work is challenging and takes work, but we want to hear from you all first. And what's one word that comes to mind when you think about the future of Crested Butte? Are you experiencing these challenges? Are you experiencing different challenges? And we want to hear from you. So feel free to type it into the Menti or into the Q&A on the Zoom as a different option as well.
And Mel, while we wait for some responses on this one, we had a late addition into what brought us here today. Snow storage was the final entry we had on what brought us here today, in addition to being a property owner, zoning, and parking. And it looks like now we have some new responses coming in on Menti.
Awesome. So some challenges or thinking about the future, stricter regulations, expensive. So again, that affordability theme. What else comes to mind? Give a few more seconds here. It's hard to sum up challenges in one word. I'm seeing a response. Interesting. Community. All right, well, let's keep moving. So navigating our challenges takes work and it takes commitment, and we're not starting the zoning code from scratch. We already have decades of previous work of adjusting and amending our zoning code that was so thoughtfully crafted in the first place to build off of. But back in 2021, that really marked a moment of creating the community compass, of going from reacting incrementally to being more proactive and strategic planning ahead for our community. So back in 21, we started with the community compass to really identify first, before we get into the details of navigating our challenges, can we start with where are we aligned as a community? What are our shared values and goals? And where do we want to go into the future? How can we commit to making decisions together with the town, with the community, that are aligned with those values? So that was really the first step from a policy standpoint, to understand what is our community value? Where's our common ground there? From there, and to try to start to implement and work towards those goals, then we started to get deeper. So hopefully you've heard of or participated in the Transportation Mobility Plan, Historic Preservation Plan, Climate Action Plan, Community Plan, and currently this year, the Parks, Recreation, Open Space, and Trails Plan, to really identify specifically, okay, what's more of our vision, our plan, our strategy when it comes to these specific goals? And then those directly influence our regulations and our programs, our zoning code, which we're talking about today, our building code, our housing strategy, and all those things. And then you can see the result of those things on the ground, a new skate park, a new housing development, a new infrastructure project. All those things are really intended to tie back to those values and goals of the community. So let's start off with just a quick recap of the Community Compass. And how familiar are you with the Community Compass? This one's multiple choice. So I'm seeing some responses from all across the board, from don't know anything about it to how could you not know about it? And that's great. We know that it's really challenging to really involve and reach everyone in our community, but we're really hopeful that all of this persistent work with the Compass, with these follow-up plans, have provided touch points or ways for the community to engage in different ways. So let's do a quick refresher on what the Community Compass was. It really was identifying those shared values and goals and recognize that we are an authentic, connected, accountable, and bold community. So our town council really strives to make decisions aligned with those 4 values. It also identified 7 strategic goals to work towards over the next 5 years. And as you can see, many of these goals are interconnected, but also can be conflicting. So what we're here today and what we did next with the community plan was really try to look at that interplay of how do we accommodate growth in a way that maintains the town and valley's rural feel with enabling people who live and work here to thrive. How can we make sure we have a thriving, affordable, engaged community, but also recognizing our small town charm and scale? And those things can work together in some ways, but really conflict in some ways. So the community plan set out to figure out a vision to try to meet those goals. So onto the community plan. How familiar are you all with the community plan? It was just adopted in July this year, but we'd love to hear from you if you've participated in it, if you've read it, if you've never heard about it. That just helps us better understand, as we always strive to do better and engage more people, more of our community through these processes. Right, I'm seeing a couple folks have read it, which is awesome. Give a few more seconds to add a response. Awesome. So let's dive into what is the community plan. So the community plan was all about how can we try to improve the livability, functionality, and sense of community in Crested Butte by leveraging the town's development regulations to thoughtfully guide free market investment in community serving housing and spaces for businesses and nonprofits. So this was not a housing plan to identify what are the next housing developments the town was going to make. This was all about how can we have the free market through our regulations and incentives be a better partner with us in meeting the community's needs to create a more thriving community. So that plan had 2 key objectives. One, to expand, diversify, and distribute community serving housing. And this is a journey the town's been on for decades now, and one we're continuing to fine tune and tweak. So it's really cool to say that 1/4 of Crested Butte's housing stock is deed restricted in some form for full-time residency, for someone working here to be a long-term rental, but it's still a challenge. Housing is still one of our community's biggest challenges, and how can the free market play a better partner in meeting those needs of the community? But on the other side, a new journey that we're starting is facilitating, creating, and preserving community serving spaces. So as new development, as new businesses and things we're starting to see some out of balance. Maybe it's the $100 steak restaurant, or maybe it's the $150 beer or the oxygen bar, things like that. We are a tourist economy and those things are needed, but how do we make sure they don't fully outpace those types of spaces and needs for our community to function year round, the childcare for our community to actually work, the trades, the plumbers and electricians that are available in here to help our residents, the affordable restaurant or those sorts of things like that. That is a new journey that we're trying to start here. So the community plan started to look at how can we try to facilitate, create, and preserve more of those spaces. So what the plan did was it identified an overall future vision and recommended different tools across different areas of town to try to meet these objectives. So it looked at different incentives or flexibility within our zoning code and regulations, and also some recommendations on complementary programs or things like that to produce more of that community serving housing and spaces. But it really took a targeted look in different areas of town, recognizing Bellevue is really different than our neighborhoods, and those types of tools and strategies might be different. So today we're going to dive into some of those considerations identified in the mobile home zone and how those are now being evaluated through the code update. So the community plan identified the vision and recommended some tools, but now we need to implement it. So the zoning code update that we're doing now is all about enabling that vision to happen through our regulations. How can we make sure it's possible for these things to happen? But then at the same time, we also need a strategy, things like complementary programs, projects, investments to implement that vision to go hand in hand with the code. So we're also doing a housing strategy and a community spaces strategy. Today, we're really talking about zoning, and we'll go over exactly the parameters of what that is, but it's important to note that at the same time, we are also going to be updating our design standards, which are going to kick off next month on November 18th, and we'll give some more information about that. So the historic preservation plan that was developed ahead of the community plan identified some recommendations that we'll talk about today that influence zoning, but that's going to lead to some changes in our design standards and what we require for architectural design across town. So we'll get into those details today, but just know both of these processes are happening. So how are we going to update the code? We've spent a lot of time so far since the adoption of the community plan this summer on doing a lot of internal review and preparation, if anything, as we evaluate all the ideas and tools recommended in the community plan. Our code also has just some inconsistencies, some cleanup, some improved definitions and things like that that need to happen. So we've done a lot of the legwork on that. And we've held a lot of work sessions with Beaux-Arts to understand what's working well, what's not, how can we improve. And for those of you who don't know, Beaux-Arts is the town's Board of Zoning and Architectural Review, and they are essentially the review authority for any new development in the town. So we've been having a lot of process conversations with them of how to improve the process. Now we're in this next phase where we've gotten some great alignment with council and Beaux-Arts and what are some guiding strategies and overall goals for this code update. We're now doing lots of community outreach with these webinars and a follow-up survey. And then we're also doing some technical and market analysis of proposed incentives that we'll talk about today and those tools identified in the community plan. And then this winter and spring, we'll continue drafting, we'll continue refining, and we'll continue community outreach. So if you did participate in the Compass for the community plan, you might know that we rewrote the Compass 7 times and the community plan 3 times. So what we're presenting today is just a first draft of considerations, and just know that your feedback will help make that better as we go forward. But we want to hear from you all. What are your preferred ways to engage in the zoning code update? So we have some ideas on here: webinars, surveys, council meetings, Beaux-Arts meetings, open houses, or can we try something new? Can we get more creative? What do you think? Awesome. So we're off to a good start with the webinars and surveys. So there will be plenty of council meetings, and Beaux-Arts meetings are always open to the public to attend. So you can always attend a work session, a discussion, or share your feedback with your elected officials. But let's
And
quickly
Mel,
go.
we did have a late addition via the Q&A too. Well, we
Oh,
see a couple
great.
more answers coming in. Talking with owners in these zones came in, which hopefully this webinar today helps with getting that started.
Yeah, thank you for catching that. And that is a great suggestion. And just know that we are always available if you want to meet individually outside of these more formal engagement opportunities. Please contact us and we're happy to meet with you, talk with you on the phone, meet over coffee to talk about the code update. So, are there any other ideas that you'd like to engage? Feel free, just open-ended to add anything else into there.
One addition coming in on Q&A that I wanted to acknowledge is visiting the zones in person, which I think builds off talking with the owners in those zones and your comment about these webinars just being one tool and that you're happy to meet one-on-one as well.
Absolutely. We would love to meet with you. We could come to you. We could meet over coffee. We're happy to meet in any way and would love to engage and talk about it. So thank you for those suggestions. And I'm
And
seeing another comment in the Q&A about a survey. So after this webinar, there will be a survey open through December 19th to give some feedback on this first draft of considerations. All right. So lastly, for this big picture, what is guiding this process? So um, we've had a meeting so far with Council and Beaux-Arts to talk about what are our guiding strategies for this code? And these are the 5 that we had really good alignment on. And I'm really excited to say that these are essentially a distillation down to culminate of like the community plan, the historic preservation plan, the climate action plan, the transportation mobility plan, all combined, essentially representing the compass. So, number one, we really want to simplify the code and our development review processes. So, how can we make sure the code is really easy to understand, easy to engage with, and is really a reflection of our community values? Number two is retaining our small town feel. We all love that, or hopefully that small town feel of Crested Butte that's inherent in that authentic value of the community compass. And how can we make sure that we really retain the feel and ensuring we protect and retain those key zoning provisions that really influence our scale and those sorts of things like floor area ratio, design standards, things like that, but also recognizing a lot of that small town feel and small town living also comes from knowing your neighbors. And how do we try to retain that as well? We want to strengthen historic preservation. So the historic preservation plan really called for changing how today the full town is viewed as one historic district. And it really looked at how our community has evolved over time and we want to preserve different periods of our community's history. So it calls for strengthening some tools around really making sure we protect our historic core, the mining era period of significance in that period of our history, but then also look at a new era of how the community transitioned from a mining town into a recreation ski town, and how can we look to protect that as well. Fourth is integrating land use with transportation and climate action and recognizing by looking at those incentives and flexibility and tools around trying to retain more community serving housing and community serving spaces in the town is a really important opportunity to bring people closer to where they work and not have as much sprawl outside of the town and folks commuting in, and recognizing that land use plays a really important role in integrating those things. And then lastly, linking zoning to community benefits. So looking at all the incentives identified in the community plan in different areas around town of can we offer some flexibility? Can we offer some incentives in different zones in exchange for community serving housing or community serving spaces? So just as a start, and this is something to think about as you think through the survey and think on these more, but which of these strategies do you think might be most important to you? I'm seeing one for simplify the code, retain our small town feel, strengthen preservation. Another in the Q&A for simplify.
And Mel, I'm seeing one come in here on needing to think about this more, and I think that's very, very fair. Zoning is complex, and it'll take a while to process all of this. That's why there's that ongoing process that Mel walked through that will iterate through some drafts of this.
Absolutely. All right. Well, what do you say? I think I've done enough talking for now. I think I'll turn it back over to you, Miles, to transition us, and then to Jesse to dive more into the details.
Thanks, Mel. And so for this portion of it, this is where Jesse's going to walk us through sort of what exists today and what changes are being proposed in the mobile zone. And so let's start with a bit of a temperature check on how familiar are you with the current zoning, and that'll be up in your Menti display right now with some multiple choices ranging from what the heck is zoning to I know it backwards and forth and follow all the zoning rules and trends nationally outside of just what's happening in town. And looks like we've got someone who's chiming in with knowing the rules of my own zone. And it looks like we've got some Q&A responses coming in as well. Very familiar. And looks like a question for our Q&A discussion too as well, which is great. If you have questions that you want to put forward for the Q&A that we're going to do in just a few minutes, feel free to enter those into the Q&A function as well. That's what it's there for, and we will address those as we get into the Q&A portion of the agenda. But it looks like we've got a lot of familiarity with the group on the call. So good familiarity with knowing the rules of this zone, and we'll dive into some of that now.
So thanks for asking that question just before, Miles, because my topic is what is zoning anyway? So some of you seem very familiar with zoning, but zoning, I wanted to give kind of a quick overview of what zoning is in case you're not familiar with zoning. But zoning's the way that a city or town divides land into different areas called zones to control how property can be used and developed. And then each zone, like we have on the screen here, there are different rules that help to determine land use, the density, how the building fits on the lot, and then other regulations like demolition, parking, floodplain, signs, those kind of things. So the main goal of zoning, though, is to make sure that the land is used in a way that is safe, organized, and supports the community's overall plan for growth. Next slide, please. So with that, there's multiple factors that go into how development is regulated. And development, those factors work together to ensure that projects are, like I said, safe, appropriate, and consistent with our community's goals, as Mel had mentioned earlier in her overview. Some of these factors for our community are, as is up on the screen, the zoning code comes together with the design standards, and then we also have building codes that come into that and subdivision regulations. Together, all of these layer together to shape how the development happens and balancing private property rights with public safety and community vision. So the development review processes are evaluated as part of each of those things. And the timelines are dictated by that. So next slide, please. So our task, oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. There you go.
I was just going to say really quick, this slide is very similar to the previous one, but overall our task with this project is just to, in this update, is just to ensure that all of our processes are easier to understand, become more efficient, if there are ways we can do that. For example, staff could potentially review certain projects administratively to help streamline the review processes if we determine those check the boxes and meet all of the goals simply. And then other projects might need different levels or layers of review. So I'll turn it over to you, Mel.
And just to give some quick context as we talk about zoning today, is that it'll influence development going forward. So any changes that might be made in the code once it's adopted, those wouldn't influence what you currently have on your property. You wouldn't be asked to change your setbacks or your parking or things like that are required to do so. It would influence development going forward. And Crested Butte is pretty built out. The map here shows vacant lots that are left in the town. And demolition and redevelopment is always a possibility, but we do have pretty strong demolition regulations where that prevents from just kind of scraping and redeveloping. So while changes from this code update would be slow and incremental, they could have an influence in the long term. But I think just keeping that context in mind, especially as you look to your own neighborhood, how it's pretty built out already. We're talking about very like incremental infill across town slowly over the years. So let's dive in specifically now to the mobile home zone. I know we're a little behind schedule and you're like, come on, let's get to the details. So the mobile home zone here on the map is these pink areas. So we have the Red Lady Estates neighborhood that is a deed restricted housing development off of Red Lady Avenue on the south side of town. And then the Upper West Side neighborhood on the northwest side of town comprise the mobile home zone, and no changes are being considered as far as the map goes. But some changes around historic preservation that we are considering, just to explain on this first draft of the zoning map, is that previously the full town was designated as a historic district. So mobile homes weren't required to like adhere to historic standards for design. Essentially anything built in the town has to meet certain design standards right now to emulate the look and feel of the mining era of the town, which is great and has really created this amazing character and charm. But the historic preservation plan called for, hey, we have some other periods of our town's history and our communities evolved, and how do we make sure we preserve that too and really show the evolution over time? So what the plan called for is looking at having the mining era period of significance in those buildings that would adhere to that set of design standards to look like the mining era would be a buffer around the National Historic Core, which is this red boundary here. And then it called for creating a new zone, which would be more of a salt and pepper district, or sorry, not a zone, a district of the early recreation era. So buildings built from when the mining, from the period of like post-mine closing to the mid-80s, where the town really transitioned from a mining town to a ski town. But that district is still to be determined. So any parcel here that's shaded on this map are all the buildings built during that time period. But right now we are doing a survey of those for architectural significance and integrity, and that will influence what that district ends up looking like. So if you are in that if you are in that time period, you have received a letter, and there will be some further outreach and communications on that process to do that. So that's why this map does look a little bit different. But in general, in the mobile home zone, it's established to really preserve land for mobile homes, and an intent, a draft intent going forward is how can we really try to incentivize year-round occupancy in these zones. The update focus areas that we'll be going through today are updating the allowed uses and parking requirements, and then exploring an incentive identified in the community plan around allowing potentially modular or stick-built homes that emulate like the look and feel of a mobile home in exchange for a permanent deed restriction for full-time residency and or workforce housing. This was an idea crafted in the community plan that we heard some initial feedback and outreach on, but we really want to hear from you all. Is this something you're interested in, would want to consider? So we will get more into that. But first, we want to hear from you. What do you love most about your neighborhood? So this is just an open-ended, feel free to type that in. The location. The location of both of these neighborhoods is pretty amazing. Some great access to trails and parks. Access to trails, commonality of full-time residents I'm seeing in the Q&A. What else do you love about your neighborhood? So I'm seeing a question, what do you mean with deed restricted? So deed restricted is when there's a restriction encumbering the property that requires it to be lived in by a full-time resident or meet certain workforce requirements or things like that. So the Red Lady Estates development on the south side of town in the mobile home zone is an example of that, where all of the homes there, the owners are required to meet certain requirements like working locally, living full-time, a certain number of months out of the year, and those sorts of things to be eligible to live there. The neighbors. Restricted number of vacation rentals. Mobile home areas, mostly long-term locals that have been here 30 plus years. This area gives a chance for locals to purchase non-deed restricted properties. And I'm seeing another one in the Q&A for the neighbors. It's awesome. Full disclosure, I am a resident of this zone and I really appreciate the neighbors as well. But we know all neighborhoods do come with challenges. So what are some challenges you're experiencing in your neighborhood? I know we heard earlier, snow storage, parking were big topics already, but what are some other challenges you might be experiencing? No snow storage and no parking, not being able to have some limited Airbnb use, having to replace with another manufactured home, snow management. We always forget this time of year, all the snow challenges, and then winter comes and we're like, oh yes, this is a challenge everywhere. Bozar makes it too expensive to update your home, existing Airbnbs. Okay, these are really great challenges that hopefully we can try to address some of these through this code update. So I know we're a little behind schedule. We're going to get into kind of the nitty gritty here, and Jesse and I are going to go back and forth to just go through the specific provisions within the zoning code for the mobile home zone and talk about the current and the proposed very first draft of what might be considered as a first draft of changes. We want to run through these. We do have fact sheets of these up on the website as well. And then we just want to make sure to save time for questions at the end. So let's start with the land use. I'll turn it back over to Jesse.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. So on the left, you see what's currently in the code, and then what proposed changes are on the right. And so I'm just going to overview those really quickly as those pertain to land uses. So in general, many of the zone districts have a long list of uses, which are either permitted or conditional uses. Permitted means that they can be done by right, and you don't have to go through an approval process. Conditional means that some level of review is required. And in general, in our case, that's Bozar. This zone is fairly simple currently as it pertains to uses. So what we're proposing with this change is so it would keep individual mobile homes as a use, clean up things like accessory buildings. Right now it says mobile home accessory buildings, and just make it more consistent with the rest of the residential zone districts. And then adding things like multiple household dwellings. So for instance, like a duplex or 2 units on a site, and then modular or stick built, as Mel mentioned, with that incentive. And then also a bed and breakfast or child care facilities. Next slide, please. Oh, and
Okay,
it goes back to you. Sorry, Mel.
getting into parking. So I know we definitely heard there's challenges with parking in these neighborhoods. But essentially, what we're looking at with the code is we regulate how many spaces are you required to provide as part of your development off street. And then, so that's shown in yellow in this image, but then there is also public on street parking that is shown in the right of way there. So right now we're really just talking about what do we require for off-street parking, but we're not necessarily talking about how do we manage parking, those things like that. But if we change requirements, we have to recognize we might have to think about parking management if there's challenges and things. One consideration that came from the transportation plan and came from the community plan was to recognize, do we consider lowering our parking requirements? We have an absolute requirement right now saying you have to build 2 spaces for each mobile home. And we're seeing in lots of towns and cities across the country and recognizing while we do have parking challenges, I think it is challenging in the zone because there's so much head-in parking on the street and not so much alley access that there's not much available on street parking. But in other areas of town, do we lower and have just a minimum that you have to meet? And then it's really saying, okay, the town's not going to dictate how many spaces you have to build, but it's really up to you. Do you want to build the minimum? Do you want to build more? Do you want to have more than that? So that's a consideration in here to provide more flexibility and space for potentially more housing, other sorts of needs. Are we open to leveraging some of our on-street parking in exchange for having potentially less of a minimum you'd have to meet off-street? But I know this is a big topic with a lot of considerations on both sides. We are seeing the state of Colorado, for example, doesn't allow cities over a certain size to have parking requirements for certain types of developments. We don't have to meet that threshold, so we have an opportunity to really come up with a solution or a requirement that works for our community. All right, back to you, Jesse.
Okay, so the lot measurements are things like lot area, which is 3,125 square feet, and then the minimum lot width of 25 feet. And we don't have any proposed changes for this. So this is a quick slide. There's a representation of what does that look like in a site plan view overview there in the photo. Next slide. Then as we talk about setbacks, the existing setbacks are front, which is 20 feet, which is where the required parking usually lives. And these are 2 newer sites here. So they are some good examples of parking. Side setbacks are 5.5 feet from the eave to the property line. And then the rear setback is 5 feet from the rear eave to the property line. And there aren't any proposed changes to those setbacks. The one thing that, again, Mel mentioned had been brought up to look at as an incentive is, could it be considered to do a second story as an incentive? Again, but we'd need to evaluate that to make sure there's proper snow storage. It's not going to be negatively impacting. We do have some buildings in this neighborhood that are portions of the buildings are 2 stories or at least 1.5 stories right now. So.
Awesome. So in our current code, we have a section around additional provisions, and it's just kind of a catch-all for different provisions that don't necessarily fit in one category. And right now there are some for the mobile home zone that dictate exterior wall height, minimum vertical distance from eave line of the roof to the finished grade level, and the roof slope. And what we really want to do in that first strategy of simplify the code is really recognize, where do things best live? So for example, things like roof slope and those sorts of things might not best live in the zoning code, but maybe more in the design standards when we're talking about the actual design and what's guiding the design of your home. And then again, with that incentive of exploring the option to replace your mobile home, again, you can always replace your mobile home with a mobile home per today's regulations, but you're not allowed under today's regulations to replace it with, say, a modular home or a home with a foundation or a stick-built home. So we're interested in hearing from you if you'd be interested in exploring an option where you could replace it with a modular stick-built home in exchange for a deed restriction to live there full time or something of that sense. But that may become some sort of additional provision.
Okay, so as far as floor area ratio goes, the mobile home district is one of the only districts that isn't actually governed by floor area ratio. FAR is the way how to measure how much building can be constructed on a piece of land. So basically the mass of the building as it relates to the square footage of the site. Mobile homes are regulated more by height and the building setbacks, so the side, rear, and front yard setbacks. So in this zone district. But we are again looking, as Mel mentioned, at that incentive to potentially allow the modular stick built in exchange for a deed restriction. So then as it relates to building measurements, the current height is 16 feet tall. And then, as I mentioned earlier on the earlier slide, we are looking at what could that look like for a second story, but just again, needing to look at snow shed and how that could impact neighbors with those small setbacks of 5.5 feet on the sides.
Yeah, we definitely recognize if you were to consider a taller building, it would have to be much narrower to account for that roof shed and tight areas for snow storage. So on that incentive, that consideration is you can replace your mobile home today with a mobile home, but mobile homes do tend to have a shelf life. And is there interest in potentially replacing it with a modular construction or a stick-built construction that maybe has design standards to kind of emulate the simplicity of a mobile home? In exchange for, if doing that, to have a deed restriction on the property where you're committing to that property owner's committing to live there full time. So that's a question that we want to hear from you all. Is there interest in that? We are going to be market testing that with some construction costs and numbers and things like that. But that is a big feedback point, recognizing the mobile home zone. And we heard it in some comments earlier that it's been an opportunity for community members to buy non-deed restricted homes, but just in seeing the cost of properties in this zone right now, is it still affordable to residents? And are there opportunities for incentives in here? So the pictures below are some examples of different types of modular construction, the left one being Sawtooth and Gunnison. But again, these are just considerations that we're exploring at this time.
So, as Mel mentioned earlier, we'll be kicking off the design standards process at the November Beaux-Arts meeting, so November 17th and 18th. Currently, as Mel mentioned, we regulate those mobile homes as if those buildings need to reflect the coal mining era, as with all buildings within town. So part of the process to update those standards will be to look at tightening up the regulations as they relate to our current period of significance. We're surveying those buildings from that new period of significance from 1961 to 1984 and determining which buildings contribute to that. And then we'll have new standards for that. And then have mass, scale, and form guide standards for buildings outside of those two periods of significance. So allowing more flexibility in style.
Okay, so that was a lot, and we are behind schedule, but we do want to make sure to leave time for your questions and thoughts. So I'm going to kick it back to Miles to wrap this up here.
Thanks, Mel and Jesse, for that thorough coverage of the current and proposed changes to the zoning in the mobile home district. So we've got a lot of good questions coming in through the Q&A, and we've got some next steps that we'll get into here in a bit. But you all should be able to raise your virtual hand if you'd like to make a comment. And while you find those buttons, we will start with the first comment we got from Olivia. Is this meeting, have you already made the decisions for the code, or is this a collaboration meeting to decide this with the owner. So I'll let Mel go into detail, but as you hopefully have heard here, this is just the first step in gathering input to inform the draft code. And so this is very much in the input gathering and collaboration phase so that we can align some of these proposed changes with our community values. Mel, is that a fair statement?
Yeah, so thank you so much for the question, Olivia. So this is very much just the very first draft of proposed considerations based on the recommendations from the community plan. So this webinar here is to really share that first draft, answer questions, gather feedback, and then that survey that's really there for you to take your time, sit with these considerations, provide feedback, and then we'll have the next draft and come back with more opportunities to collaborate and talk about that. So that's why we were asking earlier, how do you want to best engage with this? So open houses, surveys, webinars, coming to meet with you in your zone. There will be definitely lots more opportunities for that going forward.
Thanks, Mel. And I don't see any virtual hands up yet. So let's just keep going through our questions here. Olivia had another good one. Does that mean you will not be able to replace your current mobile home with another newer mobile home? I think you covered that very thoroughly in your presentation, but just to put a finer point on it, it in the proposed changes, Mel, correct me if I'm wrong here, would allow you to replace a mobile home with something that emulates that, whether it's modular, stick built, in exchange for a potential full-time deed restriction.
Yes, so you could always still replace it with a mobile home, but the proposed consideration would be to allow that additional redevelopment change in exchange for the deed restriction, but not just across the board. The mobile home replacement would be kind of the baseline status quo.
Thanks, Mel. We've got an anonymous question here on the parking slide, showing the blue area for parking being the only place that's available in the mobile home area and on First Street. So some questions about the representation of that image.
Yeah, so I definitely recognize with all the head-in parking in that area of town, on-street parking is very limited and tight. So I do recognize there's not a lot of availability on street, but with those parking requirements, again, we're talking about future development. So recognizing there is already a lot of development there, pretty much fully built out with 2 spaces each. So we wouldn't be looking at requiring all of those cars to now park on street. It would be if someone new came along and developed said, hey, I actually only want 1 spot, that could be a possibility in this first draft.
Thanks, Mel. And I'm going to jump down to a couple follow-up questions to the ones that we already hit regarding the full-time residency deed restriction. How do we define a full-time residency?
Yeah, so there's different ways to define it, but typically deed restrictions can come in different forms of you live there, apologies, live there 9 out of 12 months out of the year, is one example of that.
Thanks, Mel. And on that same vein, the question to put a little more nuance into the mobile home replacement, can you replace the mobile home with a modular home without the deed restriction? A new mobile home versus a modular home is at least a $150,000 upgrade.
Yeah, so I think this is the challenge here in recognizing the original intent of the zone was to be a more affordable area of town. And just given the costs and the price points, it is out of reach and not necessarily affordable. So if we were to consider just allowing redevelopment with stick built or modular without some sort of requirement exchange, we'd likely see those price points really escalate beyond what our full-time community members could afford to live there and might see that neighborhood drastically change in the future.
Thank you, Mel. And just a reminder for all of our attendees, if you'd like to ask your question verbally, feel free to raise your hand and we'll be able to unmute you so you can do that. Taking it back to the top on our Q&A, a couple comments here that were seconded by another attendee on no childcare facilities or B&Bs due to small lots and high density lots tight for duplexes still need 2 parking spaces due to limited on-street parking. So I believe that's more in the comment of what to consider in some of these updates. And that was also seconded by one of our attendees, as well as this comment on second stories negatively impacting light access and view corridors of adjacent landowners. So another good piece of input for us to consider.
Yeah, I think this is really great feedback. These lots and this zone is really unique. They're much more narrow lots. There's much more limited space and snow storage. That's exactly why we want to hear from you on these considerations. And I do just want to clarify in some of those considered uses of like childcare or bed and breakfast, that wouldn't be like building a childcare facility, but more the opportunity for like in-home childcare options and things like that that are still licensed through the state but can operate out of someone's home, knowing that that is quite a constrained need in the community. But again, this is why we're having these meetings and soliciting this feedback to hear from you all.
Mel, thank you for that context on that one. Pulling through onto the deed restriction, there was a comment here about deed restricting the lots will make the property lose value on the open market since you are technically restricting use. And I think that's a great comment on some of the trade-offs. And one of the core goals of the community plan is trying to increase the full-time residency and just looking for different tools and incentives to do that. But I don't know if you have any other comments that you want to make on that one.
Yeah, no, I think you put it really well that it's definitely a trade-off, and it wouldn't be something saying you have to deed restrict your property. It's saying if you want this extra benefit, you'd have to provide this in return. So it's trying to give an option there, but not saying you have to do that and change your property.
Thanks, Mel. That's great context for that one. Going on down, we've got a comment from Rich on appreciating the work and transparency here. We would be strongly against second-story homes in the district as it would likely block the views of the mountain for the neighbors, also against any commercial activity such as the childcare and B&Bs. And another comment from Rich, would also recommend renaming the zone. And I saw maybe one other comment to this end in our comments here, and that mobile home is an outdated term, manufactured home is more modern.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
And we've got a question here from Brent. Why would additional restrictions be required to build a modular or stick-built home? There are already restrictions in place. Manufactured homes have a limited shelf life, cost more to heat, depreciate, and are much harder to finance.
Yes, I think we touched on this already a little bit, but recognizing the intent of this zone is for more affordable uses and mobile homes, that just opening that up and allowing you to redevelop with sort of anything without something in return would likely drastically change the neighborhood going forward into just longer term and more of a residential zone versus that manufactured zone.
Thank you, Mel. And knowing that we're running short on time, I want to try to make sure we get through as many of these as we can. Our next question from Candace is, what's the difference between an STR and a B&B, a meal?
So an STR isn't like a use by right with a property, a short-term rental that's allowed within land uses within a zone. It's a licensed business use that's licensed to different property owners within the zone. So it doesn't like live with the land. It's not an approved or conditional land use, where a bed and breakfast is actually a commercial land use that is taxed at commercial tax rates versus an STR is not. It's at residential tax rates. That has to meet certain land use requirements for that around parking. And there is a nuanced definition too around, I think, providing a meal or something like that too, but I can get you the specific definition on Candace.
Mel, thanks so much. When will the new code take effect from Olivia?
So whenever it's adopted, we're aiming right now for an adoption late spring, early summer next year, but we really want to make sure to take the time with you all, with the community, to really get the code right. So there will be a lot more outreach to come in the final drafts. And then when it does come towards adoption time, ideally next year, there would be a BOZAR hearing and recommendation to the council. There would be a council first reading, and then there would be a public hearing at council.
Thanks for that, Mel. And a couple comments here. I think this is more in the rhetorical category. How could you have childcare when most mobile homes have no outside space? And I think we've already heard there's some concerns with potential commercial uses. Another question from our same anonymous attendee is, so could you purchase another property to deed restrict for upgrading the mobile home?
I think that's something we could evaluate and take a look at as we continue on through this process.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. One more here. Some homes on the block do not look fire safe. Can the city do anything to ensure every home is up to code?
Please contact us at the Community Development Department if you have concerns, and we're happy to talk to you and talk about that.
Excellent. Thank you, Mel. And then we've got a comment from Molly on a great interactive session. Another great meeting. I'd suggest tightening the opening slides and leaving more time for the Q&A. And that's great feedback. I think this is our first one with adding some of the Mentimeter activities. It slowed us down. So that is wonderful feedback. And I think something we'll take to heart. From Olivia, to address one of the comments on second story concerns, you showed a picture of one of the taller, maybe modular homes on Butte. Does that have a second story already?
So it doesn't have a second story, but it was a stick-built addition that kind of was non-conforming with our current code. But I believe it's above the current height limit of the 16 feet. And I know we are at 5, but it does look like Olivia has her hand up. If you'd like to ask your question, Olivia.
And Olivia, you look to be unmuted, but we cannot hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yes.
Oh, yay. First of all, thank you so much for putting this together. This has been great, and I know it's a lot of work, so thank you. But yeah, I was just looking at that picture, and I was curious if that's 16 feet, and then you have the second story. I mean, I don't think that building looks that bad. I know some people are very concerned about the second story, but I know, I think the planning team is trying to create a little bit more density, and I don't know. I think it might be a good idea, but I could see concerns in regards to, some of the lighting. But I do think that building looks really good, and maybe a couple more feet, it wouldn't be so bad. And then just thinking about the mobile homes already, they have maybe like 2 or 3 feet, since a lot of them are on the axles or have, skirting. So bringing that back down, I don't know, could be something to think about when we think about the height.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. That's some really great feedback, and there's definitely trade-offs on both sides, so we'll definitely take that into consideration.
Thank you.
So we are 3 minutes over, and I just so appreciate the feedback on tightening our slides. As Miles said, this is shaking off our first webinar. We have 6 more to go, so really appreciate that feedback, and we'll be working on doing that. But there is a fact sheet on our website at this QR code to really take on one sheet all of these considerations we presented today, and then we'll have an open survey through December 19th to give feedback as detailed or as general feedback as you like to give. But beyond that, if you want to talk, if you want us to meet with you, if you want to call us for additional questions or thoughts, please email or call us here in the Community Development Department. Again, I'm Mel, and I just want to thank you all so much for being with us today, and we hope to maybe catch you at another webinar over these coming weeks. So thank you all again, and I hope you all have a wonderful Wednesday.